Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee, because today we are going to be discussing the book of 2 Samuel. Hey, faithful listeners. Hope you had a fantastic weekend, and thanks for coming on the podcast this morning to share a cup of coffee with me. Now, if you didn't get a chance to listen to the interview I did with Sarah M., you are missing out. It is up on YouTube, and it is also up on Rumble. I now have a Rumble account for the podcast, so you can find it on Rumble as well. But it was a fantastic interview. I highly recommend everybody go and watch it, because she talks about growing up in a communist regime, one of the most dangerous, actually. She grew up during the time of the Khmer Rouge, I believe it was called, with Pol Pot back in Cambodia in the 70s and 80s. And she actually went to a work camp. And at one point she went to a death camp, but God protected her through all of that. So she tells her story, and she actually shares about her faith as well, and discusses the dangers of communism. So it's a great episode. Check it out on YouTube or Rumble. All right, let's read 2 Samuel 13, 23 through 38. We're going to finish up talking about this story of Absalom and Amnon. If you guys remember what happened last week, we talked about how Amnon, one of the sons of David, actually the firstborn son of David, raped his sister named Tamar, and then he hated her so much after he raped her, he threw her out, and she had to go live in desolation, basically, with her other brother, Absalom, her true brother, rather. They were both from the same mom. So Absalom now hates Amnon because of what Amnon did to Tamar. And unfortunately, David did not correct the issue. So we'll talk about that today as well. Grab your Bible and your cup of coffee. Let's go ahead and read. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shears in Baal Hazor, which is beside Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. Absalom came to the king and said, "See now, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." The king said to Absalom, "No, my son, let's not all go, lest we be burdensome to you." He pressed him. However, he would not go, but blessed him. Then Absalom said, "If not, then please let my brother Amnon go with us." The king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom pressed him, and he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Absalom commanded his servants, saying, "Mark now when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I tell you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant." The servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and every man got up on his mule and fled. When they were on the way, the news came to David, saying, "Absalom has slain all the king's sons, and there is not one of them left." Then the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn. Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, answered, "Don't let my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead. For by appointment of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore, don't let my lord the king take this thing to heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead." But Absalom fled. The young man who kept watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming by way of the hillside behind him. Jonadab said to the king, "Behold, the king's sons are coming. It is as your servant said." As soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept. The king also and all his servants wept bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai the son of Amir, king of Geshur. David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there for 3 years. King David longed to go out to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, since he was dead. We can see that after the rape of his sister, Absalom has broken. There's something in him that broke. And in fact, the next few chapters are going to be about Absalom almost exclusively. But the start of all of it was the rape of his sister. And he became so rageful, so angry at everybody involved that he was scheming to kill Amnon. It says that after 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is beside Ephraim, and Absalom invited all of the king's sons. This means that for 2 years, Absalom was scheming and trying to figure out how to kill Amnon. And it probably didn't help that David himself didn't correct Amnon after what Amnon did to his sister. I mean, all of these were David's children. He should have corrected the situation. And I'm sure that Absalom was also angry and hateful towards David as well. We're going to see that in the coming chapters. And I think all of this stemmed from what happened to Tamar. But that still does not give Absalom an excuse. It says after 2 years, Absalom decides to host a big party because it was sheep shearing time. And apparently during the time of sheep shearing, it was a time of celebration and giving to each other, almost like Christmas or Thanksgiving in a way. And so this was a big time in Israel for just a party and enjoying oneself and having goodwill toward your fellow neighbors. So Absalom, who has sheep and is about to shear them, decides to host this big party. And so it says that Absalom came to the king himself, King David, and he said, "See now, your servant here has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." I like that Absalom is pretending to be humble here. He's calling himself King David's servant, which is interesting, even though he was David's son. And I think it would not have been abnormal for Absalom to call David dad or father, but Absalom is pretending to be super humble here. He's like, "Oh, King David, your servant, me, is hosting this big party, and your servant wants you to come and enjoy the party with your servant." And so David says to Absalom, "No, my son." I love that he doesn't refer to Absalom as his servant. He says, "My son. No, my son, let's not all go, lest we be burdensome to you." But Absalom was pressuring him. He's like, "No, Dad, you have to be there. Your servant wants you there. You have to be there." But David is firm. And he says, "No, we're not going to all be there. I'm not going to come because I don't want to burden you with more work to do. So you just enjoy yourself." It says he gives Absalom a blessing. So Absalom then says, "Well, if you can't come, then please let my brother Amnon go with us." And Absalom almost ruined it for himself by mentioning Amnon's name because David says, "Why should he go with you?" So David gets a little bit suspicious there. He's like, "What are your intentions? Why do you want Amnon to go specifically? You don't seem to have a very good relationship with Amnon. Why do you want Amnon to go to this party with you?" So Absalom kind of has to backtrack here because he says to King David, "Please let all the king's sons go. Not just Amnon, but all of them. I want all my brothers there with me to eat." So he pressures King David, and King David gives the blessing. He says, okay, all the sons can go with you. Enjoy yourselves." So it says here that now the day of the party has come, and Absalom commanded his servants, saying, "Mark now when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I tell you strike Amnon, then kill him." Now, one thing we can say about Absalom, he doesn't have very many redeeming qualities, but one quality he does have is he's very patient. I mean, he waited 2 whole years to get back at Amnon, and now he's waiting again. He's waiting until Amnon becomes drunk before he strikes him. So Absalom did have the quality of patience, I suppose, but it was misguided patience. He commands his servants to kill Amnon after Amnon becomes drunk. And he says, "Don't be afraid." So he gives this pep talk. He's like, "Don't be afraid. I've commanded you. Be valiant, be courageous, be strong." It says the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. So Amnon is getting drunk with all of his brothers. Maybe Amnon was even a little bit nervous to see Absalom. It's possible because of what Amnon had did to Absalom's sister, like true sister, only 2 years before this. Maybe Amnon was a little bit afraid, but then after the wine is coming out and the feasting is happening, Amnon lets his guard down and drinks to excess And now Absalom gives the signal for his servants to kill Amnon, and that is what they did. Then it says that all the king's sons arose, and every man got up on his mule and fled. So the rest of the sons are terrified, obviously, because they just saw one of their brothers get killed right in front of them. They're terrified, so they run outside, and they hop on their mules, and they run away. They're terrified. It says that while they were on the way, the news came to David saying, Absalom has slain all the king's sons and there is not one of them left. And what's really great about this is David believes it. He doesn't question it. He's just like, yes, Absalom certainly killed every single one of my sons. And that just shows what Absalom's personality was like. Maybe David knew that he was kind of a conniving sort of character. Maybe there is a reputation that Absalom had because David doesn't question it. He's just like, yes, this definitely happened. It says the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth, and all of his servants stood by with their clothes torn. So everybody believes the story that Absalom killed every single one of David's sons. Now, I tried to look up a reason why this story would have gotten spread like that, since Absalom only killed Amnon. But sometimes, misinformation gets spread. Maybe there was so much panic. Maybe one of the servants of one of the other sons saw Amnon get killed and ran out thinking that Absalom was going to kill everybody. Maybe that's what this servant thought. And maybe there's just so much chaos that erupted that a wrong story just got spread to King David. That's kind of what I think. But David believes it. So Jonadab, for some reason, is there. He must have either known about this plot beforehand or seen the entire thing happen and somehow got to King David first. It says that Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, answered, "Don't let my lord suppose that they killed all the young men, all the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead. And the reason he's dead," he says, "is because Absalom has been determining this from the day that he forced his sister Tamar." So somehow Jonadab knew about this. If you remember what we talked about on Friday, Jonadab was actually the one that gave Amnon the idea to rape Tamar. It was Jonadab's idea from the very beginning, and it says specifically that Jonadab was a crafty man, or he was a subtle man. So he had his nose in a lot of people's business, is what it sounds like. And it also sounds like he thought up very crafty ideas. Maybe, just maybe, Jonadab helped Absalom think up a plot to kill Amnon. It is possible. Scripture does not say that, but it is a little funky that Jonadab knows the whole story and is there with King David before anybody else was able to get there. So that makes me think that Jonadab knew what was going to happen. And just knowing Jonadab's personality and how he was able to think up a scheme to help Amnon rape his sister, it's very possible that Absalom consulted Jonadab for how he could easily kill Amnon. And maybe Jonadab thought up the entire idea. Maybe he was like, Absalom, host a party and kill Amnon there. So who knows, though? Once again, scripture does not say that. So Jonadab, I suppose, gives David the good-ish news that only one of his sons is dead. Now, of course, it's not good news in any way, because having a child die is probably the worst thing anybody could ever go through. So Jonadab in verse 33 says to David, "Therefore don't let my lord the king take this thing to heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead." But during this time, it says Absalom fled. So Absalom had a getaway plan, and he knew that he would have to if he was to kill Amnon, who once again was David's firstborn, meaning Amnon was the first in line for the throne. So this was a capital crime that Absalom committed, so he immediately fled. It says that while everything is getting sorted out and David is mourning and Jonadab is explaining the whole situation, that a young man who is keeping watch looked and saw many people coming by the way of the hillside behind him. So Jonadab said to the king, behold, the king's sons are coming. It is as your servant said. So it is super weird. Once again, that Jonadab knows everything, right? That he's like there for some reason and knows the whole story and knows that the king's sons are coming. Very strange. That's why I think that Jonadab was part of all this. And it says that the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept. So all the king's sons get to the king and they start crying because they were probably traumatized. They're probably in the middle of eating their meal and suddenly their big brother was dead next to them. Not to mention, they probably thought that their lives were next. They didn't know. So they are traumatized and they start crying. And it says that the king also and all of his servants wept bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Amihir, king of Geshur. So Absalom went to his grandfather, actually, because Absalom's mother was from Geshur. So this king was actually Absalom's grandfather, I believe. So Absalom finds refuge there in Geshur with his grandfather. And it says that David mourned for his son every day. And that's not Amnon that it's talking about. It's actually talking about Absalom. David was mourning for Absalom. He was very sad that Absalom fled. And actually, Absalom not only fled, but he lived there for 3 years, is what it says in verse 38. And to conclude, King David longed to go see Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon since he was dead. So 3 years passed, and David starts mourning the loss of Absalom. Because Amnon was dead, there was nothing David could do to bring Amnon back from the dead, but he longed to see the son that was alive. He longed to see Absalom and bring him back home. Now on Wednesday, we'll talk about what happens in the next chapter as the story of Absalom continues. And it is a very crazy story, as a matter of fact. So we'll read about that on Wednesday. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode, and I hope that you have been enjoying the Bible Explained podcast. And actually, the 1000th episode is coming up very soon. Next month, on August 2nd, we will have our 1000th episode here on the podcast. So pat yourselves on the back if you've been listening through since the book of Genesis. Guys, there won't be an episode on Thursday because it is Independence Day. But tomorrow we'll be talking about the book of Romans, so I hope to see you all there, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up. Happy listening, and God bless.